Thank you everybody for inviting me to give this talk. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to attend personally, but of course, because of the global pandemic, everybody's schedule has changed. So I will try to do justice to it by talking from distance. Just before I start, my name is Dimitri Ioannides, and I am a professor based at the European Tourism Research Institute at Mid-Sweden University in Sweden. And I am a person who has quite a lot of background in tourism planning and development, sustainability, with an emphasis primarily on work in peripheral areas, rural areas, islands, and nowadays more and more in Arctic and subarctic regions. So what I'm going to talk about today is about tourism in peripheral areas and basically talk a little bit about obstacles and opportunities. And then I will talk about, at the end, I will actually introduce micro-entrepreneurs as an opportunity for basically tourism development in remote areas, based on some work we have done here in Sweden. Okay, so just to start with some definitions, first of all, the question is, what do we mean by rural? And of course, there's different types of rurality. You know, there's areas that are just beyond the city, on the rural urban fringe. There's areas that are very remote. For example, where I live here, if I could show you outside the window now, if you go 10 kilometers from here, you're out in Europe's wilderness. You're out in an area where it's just mountains, lakes, and very, very few people. It's very remote. You have borderlands, areas that are often between two countries, and very often, again, those tend to be not always, but tend to be mountainous or tend to be away from the urban areas. And then you have what I call the boring bits in between, those areas that are neither too remote, but not immediately outside the city. So basically something in between. Probably a lot of rural areas in Greece, rural areas in Italy, probably in Serbia also, fit that kind of description. And of course, not all rural areas are equal. Some are more accessible than others. Maybe some are close to a major highway or have good links because they're close to a railway station. Maybe they even have a railway station, whereas others can become quite isolated. Quite often, maybe they become isolated because you build a new highway and the old roads are no longer useful, or you stop service because it's too expensive, bus service or rail service to a particular area. So this accessibility can actually improve or decline over time. The other thing about peripheral areas not being equal is that, in fact, within rural areas, we have what we call nested peripheralities or nested peripheries. That means that whereas you might have, say, one large village or one rural community that's actually quite central because it has quite a few services, maybe it has a school, maybe it has the police station, that's where you know, some local government functions are there, maybe some small-scale industries, and then it might be surrounded by other smaller communities which have fewer resources. Therefore, even within rural areas, you will have some areas which are more central and other areas which are more peripheral. And the best example I can give you is, for example, if you think of an archipelago of many, many islands, such as the islands we have in the Aegean, you will have one island that might be the link to the rest of the world. That's where the major airport is. That's where all the services are located. And then you'll be surrounded by smaller islands that are quite remote, more difficult to get to. So that's what I mean by nested peripheralities. So again, what I'm trying to say here is that not all rural is equal, and therefore we have to kind of keep that at the back of our minds. Now, why do we promote tourism in rural areas? And of course, as we know, rural areas very often face a number of challenges. Many of them probably face economic decline because of traditionally they've been dependent on primary extractive industries or farming or fishing, or even resource-based industries like logging and wood manufacturing and things like that. And what happens is often these industries basically decline, just like any other manufacturing or any other activity, because of global competition. And then what happens is these areas basically lose their competitiveness, and people might move out. Tourism is seen as an opportunity to revive the economy. And why tourism? Partially because tourism is perceived as an industry that has limited barriers to entry. It's quite relatively cheap to start a business activity, especially a small-scale business activity. It's quite easy to recycle existing buildings or farming units into some kind of tourism activity. If you have an extractive past like we have here up in the north of Sweden, for example, mining or forestry, very often, even if these activities have been abandoned, they have left behind infrastructure, for example, roads, airfields, power plants, and things like that. And therefore, there is actually some form of accessibility for tourists to come there. And then I think more recently, I think where people have second homes in rural areas, there is the potential to use these underutilized housing stock in housing peer-to-peer platforms such as Airbnb, and basically extract something from them. So very often nowadays, whereas Airbnb is associated with major cities, in fact, it can, in the case of rural areas, be perceived as an opportunity, perhaps, for using buildings that otherwise lie empty for most of the time. Now, of course, not all rural areas are created equal. Some of them happen to be in beautiful settings, close to lakes, beautiful mountains, close to the coast. Others, such as maybe, you know, if you're in Kansas, even though I have nothing against Kansas, but they might lack any kind of outstanding landmarks. They might be relatively flat. There is no major bodies of water. They might struggle to attract tourists. So, you know, if you're in the Alps, it is quite easy probably to draw tourists. If you're in some relatively dry, flat land, not close to the water, without many historical attractions, it'll be much harder to bring the tourists. So obviously places vary depending on the resources they have. You know, if you're close to a national park, close to the seaside, or if it's a major battlefield ground or something else happened historically, then yeah, sure, you can bring tourists. What do other communities do to bring tourists? Well, what they can do is they can host festivals. They can celebrate maybe their ethnic heritage, maybe because they have a particularly ethnic group living there that is probably different to the rest of the country. So for example, again, I'll use the example of Sweden. We have Sami communities. Samis, of course, are the indigenous people of Northern Europe. Sometimes, you know, they can use that heritage to their advantage to attract tourists. Another one is to profile your gastronomy or your wines, you know, your food and drink. and basically rely on those kind of associations to draw tourism. And then increasingly, based on what has happened in several attractive cities, nowadays, some rural areas, especially ones that might have a lot of amenities like skiing or the close to the coast, they've begun trying to attract the creative class. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the creative class theory, but this is the idea that people who essentially belong to the highly educated, the people who might be artists or people who are involved in software development or work in the publishing business, they don't necessarily have to live close to their employers. They can basically work from distance. That means that they can choose to live in an attractive rural village, mountainous community. And a lot of these communities try to attract these kind of people because they can live there year round, which is actually the aim of these communities. Some food for thought, something to think about while we move on. But changing gears a little bit, I want to now talk about one specific issue that relates to rural areas, and that's basically small-scale entrepreneurs. And I have this quote here that says, basically starting off is, how can sustainable tourism be understood and addressed without appreciating the role of small enterprises? This was from a paper by Shaw and Page from about 9 years ago, where they were basically trying to say that we really need to understand a little bit more about who tourism entrepreneurs are, how do they function, how do they survive, what motivates them, how do they learn, how do they innovate, how do they develop products, things like that. And so the argument is that very often in a lot of areas around the world, when we talk about rural tourism, we're not talking about large-scale hotels or large-scale businesses or chain-based businesses. We're talking about small-scale mom and pop type of businesses. So we have local entrepreneurs develop things like bed and breakfasts. They work as guides. They work as people who rent out kayaks or ski equipment, stuff like that. Often these entrepreneurs don't actually have a lot of resources. They're relatively small scale. They don't have a lot of financing. Many of them are what we call lifestylers. They live in these areas because either they are from these areas or they have chosen to move to these areas, maybe because they have a particular hobby that they like. For example, they love to ski and therefore they want to live in a ski area, but also they want to make money from that. This is the type of people we're talking about. But now, the type of resources these people use very often, other than maybe their own buildings and a little bit of money that they might have, is that very often they take advantage of their surroundings, what we call the commons. So for example, if I'm a guide, I don't normally take people on my own land and guide them, but I basically take them I guide them into the forests or into the national park. That means I'm using either publicly available land or land to which I have access. For example, in Sweden, we have what is known as public right of access, which means that if I'm hiking out in the countryside, I can actually walk on other people's land without any problem, as long as I don't, start a fire or put trash or anything like that. There's kind of an idea that we all respect each other's private property, but we can also use it. Therefore, if I'm a guide, I can actually take people on guided tours to look at wildlife or look at flowers or whatever, but walk through people's private land. That's what I mean by access to these common resources. Now, I'll come back to that, but first of all, a little bit of background on studying microfilms in tourism. Most of the work that has been done on microfilms in tourism, and there's been quite a lot, tends to be about the owner managers of these small scale companies. It's about their motivations. You know, why did you become a bed and breakfast owner, or why did you start your small business? It's about their stories. Who are they? Did they retire? Did they get fed up of working in finance in the city? You know, what was it that led them to do what they did? And a lot of the studies tend to be inductive, and they tend to not really have much of a theoretical background, framework rather, because they tend to be based on case studies rather than broader samples and comparative research. So the idea here, which was actually an idea of one of my PhD students who will be defending his thesis in November, was let's look at entrepreneurs, but understand a little bit more about how it is that these individuals who face a lot of challenges because they don't have a lot of resources, how do they develop their products? How do they innovate? How do they learn? Who do they learn from? And so what the student did, basically, he did a series of studies of different small-scale companies and basically tried to answer these questions. So the aim is essentially, he used something which comes from broader business studies, but is not so well known in the tourism studies field. He used the conceptual lens or the theoretical framework of something known as entrepreneurial bricolage, arguing that rural microfirms tend to use resources which maybe they don't actually own themselves, but they basically put together different types of resources that they have in order to make products and in order to design tourism experiences. And that is something that we primarily see in rural areas. And so the aim of this, the rest of the presentation, is basically to generate some knowledge about the resourcing behaviors of tourism microfirms in rural areas. What is it that they make into a product? How do they make the decision? And basically expand this theoretical framework of what spatial bricolage is where you actually use resources that are geographically available within the area where you're located. And I'll explain that in a bit if it sounds a little bit abstract at the moment. So essentially what entrepreneurial bricolage, as I said, there is quite a lot about it in business studies. And I'm not a business studies expert, so I won't go into too much depth about it. But entrepreneurial bricolage is about how you mobilize resources. You take resources that exist, how you search for them, access them, and transfer them. It is also a way that shows how business owners, entrepreneurs, create value in areas or in environments which don't have a lot of resources. So how do you generate value from the resources that you have? So if you have a constrained or a limited number of resources, how do you make value out of them? And that's something that's specifically relevant to rural areas because most of these entrepreneurs don't have a lot of resources. And bricolage, this is based on writings of Levi Strauss from 1966, where he says it's basically the behavior of a jack of all trades, a person who does everything really, whose rules of his game are always to make do with whatever is at hand. And I'm not sure whether you know this expression in English, but make do is essentially to take whatever I have and make something out of it. I have a limited set of resources and I create something out of it, even though it doesn't look like much to begin with. So I make something out of very little. That's what essentially bricolage is. Now, in the case of this particular research, I'm sorry, I think, no, okay. In this particular case, we're talking making do by applying combinations of resources at hand to new problems and opportunities. So whatever those resources might be buildings, they can be, I don't know, equipment, they can be knowledge, you know, which doesn't necessarily tie to tourism, but I make use of it and make some kind of product that relates to tourism. So creating something from nothing, and I think I'll skip the other two. I don't think they're too relevant for this presentation, but if you're interested, I believe I have sent a copy of the paper, or I can send a copy of the paper that has been written on this topic. It's a publication that came out in the journal Tourism, Sustainable Tourism, just a few months ago. Now, one thing about entrepreneurial bricolage is that while you can use these resources in a rural setting and make something out of very little, there is also a danger that because you're relying on these very limited resources, you basically become a little bit cautious in terms of how you run your business. What I mean by that is you tend to reduce your risk. Therefore, you don't do very risky, you don't undertake very risky ventures, if you like. The aim of these small-scale businesses is more to survive rather than to grow. You know, so one of the problems with entrepreneurial bricolage is that it tends to make you rather conservative, and you don't basically adopt very ambitious or very kind of creative ways of developing your business. You basically go with what is the safest, if you like. Now, moving on from general bricolage, we have developed this concept of spatial bricolage, which is, I think, very relevant to the rural areas, especially because spatial bricolage is specifically about the geographical resources that are available in a particular area that somebody who wants to develop tourism or any other type of business takes advantage of. So this is a quote from one of the very few articles we have read that talk about spatial bricolage, where they say this is where you make do by applying combinations of the resources at hand in the immediate spatial context. So this is what I was mentioning before. For example, you take advantage of the fact that in the area where you are located, there's a forest. The forest becomes a resource for your job. If you're a guide and you want to guide visitors to see wolves or birds or I don't know, flowers, you know, fauna and flora. The spatial bricolage is where you take advantage of the fact that you have those kind of resources in the vicinity of your business, but you don't necessarily own those resources. You're basically using these resources that are available to everybody else, and you're making a product out of them. So it is, spatial bricolage is something that has to do with localized activities. The idea is that they have to be geographically located in the area. It can be used to explain entrepreneurial practices in rural areas. It basically departs from the point of view that entrepreneurs can utilize resources beyond their control or ownership. They don't outright own them, but they make use of them, and treats geographical context as a resource. So where you are located becomes a resource for your business. You take advantage of it. You tend to use local resources and supplies. And by the way, that can also be where you take advantage of the fact that maybe in the area you have, as I said before, kind of a tradition of organically grown, locally produced food. And then you basically ensure that part of your product uses that type of resource for your bed and breakfast. For example, for doing your breakfast, you use locally provided eggs, locally provided conserves and things like that. But it can also be a little bit more abstract. It's where you can actually take local folk stories or storytelling and different types of art, poetry, literature, and you basically use these narratives to generate some kind of product in the area. The other way of using local resources is basically where you actually engage local people, for example, retirees living in the community, and they participate in running your business. Maybe they work as volunteers, they act as guides, they do storytelling, they basically tell the children something about the past of the area or whatever. So it's not just about using local resources, geographical resources, but it's also about how you make use of the people who are in the area and what they can actually provide towards developing your tourism product. So spatial bricolage allows access to local information, knowledge, and resources that are geographically located. It allows firms the capacity to discover and exploit opportunities in their direct geographic surroundings. But just like in general bricolage, there is a problem that if you depend so much on these locally available resources, again, you can become a little bit path dependent and maybe a little bit not too adventurous, and basically you tend to stagnate as a business because the emphasis of the business is essentially to basically survive rather than grow very rapidly and become bigger and profit oriented. So kind of as a theoretical aspect, spatial bricolage also is tied to the concept of embeddedness. The fact that in order to have spatial bricolage, it means that your entrepreneur has to be local and has to be locally embedded in that particular community and basically takes advantage of these geographical resources I mentioned earlier on. But there's also a problem that sometimes when you're taking advantage of certain resources that are locally available as an entrepreneur, you might cause certain problems with the rest of the people in the community because they might see you as a threat to an established way of life. And you're basically creating, by you creating a new product out of something, they might see that as problematic. And I'll come back to that in a second. I have a slide that talks about that. Let's see. So bricolage, especially generally entrepreneurial bricolage and also spatial bricolage, has not really been talked about much in tourism research. This paper that we wrote was one of the very first. There are a few papers on this topic. We argue that spatial bricolage is a fitting description of how rural tourism entrepreneurs design value propositions that are based on local, tangible, and intangible resources. So what I'll do to kind of illustrate the case, I think it's better than talking too theoretically, which might be a little bit too abstract. I'll use one example that comes out of my PhD student's thesis. And what he did is he did a study in the county of Dalarna, which is, if this is Stockholm, this is Sweden, of course. I'm located, just so you can see, I'm located up here in Östersund. That's on this lake here. So pretty much in the middle of the country. The distances from the south to Östersund is about 1,000 kilometers. From here to the north of the country is another 1,000 kilometers. So it's a very long country, a very large country in terms of length, just to get an idea. But anyway, Jonathan, my student, was doing his study on the county of Dalarna. It's a county that is considered mostly rural, but it is not the wilderness that you would find up in these regions up here. So it's what we would call the boring bits in between. The county of Dalarna has 28,000 square kilometers, so it's quite large, with about 250,000 inhabitants. It's known as the most Swedish of counties. It's kind of like it fits the image of what tourists think Sweden is. So it's very stereotypical Swedish. Lakes, these Dala horses, which are these kind of statues of horses that people know about around the world, and you know, local dress and things like that. It's an established tourist destination. It's well known for its culture, nature, and heritage. And the firms, 2/3 of the firms that he studied operate in Dalarna, and some of them were kind of just on the border in these surrounding counties. But for all intents and purposes, we're talking about this area here. In his study, he did 18 interviews with owners of microfilms, asked questions about the firm's background, the owner's background, what is the product, who are the customers, how do these people work with local people, how do they use the culture, how do they use their environment. The companies were selected purposely, basically through a kind of snowball. They were microfilms. The main product had to be something, very Swedish. A lot of them tended to be companies that offer guiding tours rather than just bed and breakfasts. And this is what I was talking about. These are the type of things that you find there. These are the Dala horses. You have wildlife. There are bears, there are wolves in the area. If you're lucky, or unlucky, I'm not sure, you can see them. You can do kayaking. Of course, this is all the summer activities. You can see moose, lots and lots of lakes. And of course, you have relatively heavy winters, so there's winter sports during the winter months. But most of these companies tend to be summer-based enterprises. So basically, the main attractions in the area are forests, lakes, wildlife. And as I said before, in Sweden, people, that's the public, generally has what we call the right of public access. That means that I can walk through somebody's private forest or private land, as long as I don't get too close to their home, as long as I don't start a fire or anything like that. The idea is, it's based on the idea of mutual respect, that we use the land as an access point, but we don't actually damage anything. Whatever we take in, we take out, that kind of thing. So what these people do, these guides, they essentially, a lot of them, as I said, do things like wildlife tours. And very often they tend to use, they tend to basically take their clients, they take them through somebody else's private land. And so spatial bricolage is making use of the access. And then while they're on that land, they're using the water, they're, for boating, or they're basically looking at animals, or taking photographs of birds, or things like that. Some of the quotes that we collected from these interviews with these people. So this person here basically talked about the resources being things that are basically appreciating the place that you're located. And so he says, or she says, much of what we do with our guests is culture, how we engage with nature, the right of public access, fishing, being in the forest, cutting wood. Cutting wood, of course, you have to have permission to do that. Picking berries, that's acceptable. You can pick berries and mushrooms, especially during this time of the year. This is a culture, this is our culture, this is what Swedes do generally, and people from other countries want to know about it. Anything that is local would be interesting. So what this entrepreneur is doing is essentially showing him what Swedes do in the summers, what do they do in the forest. And it's a very basic product, but he's making use of things that people actually do to begin with. Then another person says there's a long list of resources that are important for this airport tour. But probably more than anything else, it is the interaction with local people to see a different way of rural living that is a core product. So he's basically making use of the fact that here are the local people doing whatever these local people are doing. They're producing food, they're farmers, woodworkers, and he's making them part of the product. This other person just talks about the forest being a resource, and saying that it generates a special feeling. And this other person says we see what is around and who is around and try to make something out of it. So spatial bricolage, as I said, is a resourcing strategy that is embodied by looking around to see who or what is available for use. It is an approach which in tourism reflects that what is local could be interesting. So it could be a building, it could be a way of dance, or a way of art, or whatever. And it's a way that firms for which the place constitutes a fundamental part of their business. I mean, they're located where they are, and they wouldn't be located anywhere else. So the surroundings basically make that company what it is. And we had one example which was very interesting. This was what we call the wolves example. There was one company that essentially offers tours to look at wildlife, and in Sweden you have some of Europe's big wildlife, for example, wolves. And this person said, yes, I had in the past an idea to have a tour focusing on wolves. I ran it once, but then I decided not to do it, or to let it be. I think that if I would have gone on with it, the whole village would have turned against me for making the wolves into a positive thing. I cannot deal with the conflicts that would have come. So what this case was, this was a Dutch woman we have a lot of immigrants in Sweden who come basically because they love the wilderness, and they start businesses, like this woman from Holland. And she had this great idea to basically run wolf tours because she thought, that's something really interesting, especially for foreigners. But what she didn't realize was that the local population looks at wolves as a threat to their animals. And they don't like wolves. They obviously see them as not a resource, but they see them as something bad. So she went to use the wolves as part of this spatial bricolage as a product, if you like, and she realized that the people were against her. So eventually, in order not to make enemies, and because she felt that she was still new in the village, she basically decided that that wasn't a good idea, and she started something else, that working with wolves would not have been a good concept. So obviously using local resources doesn't mean that conflicts do not occur. And I think this was another one, also Dutch. She says, everything was fine until I posted a picture of a wolf on Facebook. People here accused me that I attract wolves on purpose, because they were saying, oh, in order to do the tour, you must be putting something for the wolves to come. which was not true because they're not allowed to do that. But people thought that that's what was going on, and they were really angry with me. I spoke to them and I explained myself. Actually, now I think their anger became pride, and they now say it loud that it is their forest that people from all over the world come to experience because of the crazy Dutch guy. So in this case, this guy actually does wolf tours. He had people against him, but in the end, people realized, oh, we get a lot of tourists here, so maybe it's okay that the tourists come and see the wolves. They changed their mind. Whereas the first person, this F2, she decided it wasn't worth angering the local population. So going back to the concept of bricolage, the idea with bricolage is that resources are accessible, that they might not belong to you, but they're ones that you can make access to quite easily. There are resources that might involve multiple stakeholders. What I mean by that is that you as an entrepreneur make use of the resources, but you might have to negotiate with other stakeholders. It's not always that you can just walk in and say, okay, I'm going to start doing whatever I'm doing. I might have to talk maybe to the local landowner and explain to them, I'm going to have a tour going through your land, this kind of thing. Resource transfer is about how an additional actor assumes interest in and responsibility for a resource. And it also necessitates some kind of governing mechanism aiming to mitigate the risk of opportunistic behavior, because what you don't want to do is basically look to your neighbors and to other stakeholders in the community that you're basically taking advantage without giving anything back to the community. And this thing about resource transfer was interesting from one interview where this person says, I have a bear hide. This is where you actually have like a small area where you kind of hide, and then from there you can, without the animals knowing that you're there, that you can watch the bears and take pictures of them. But he also said that he was part of some local association, and this association is for landowners. So what this person, even though this person could have used the land without paying, he felt guilty that he was using land in an area that he wasn't a member. So he actually asked them to send him a bill for basically using the land, because he felt, I'm making money out of this. Therefore, in order to be friends with everybody, I'll do the proper thing and I will actually pay them for using this particular area, even though there is no law that mandates that he does that. He just wanted to make friends and not basically get the stakeholders in the area angry. I'm not sure whether that's clear. So what I'm trying to say here, that is, some of these entrepreneurs feel that the best thing to do, even though they do not have to pay a fee, they prefer on their own to set some kind of fee that they pay to either the municipality, if it's a municipal owned land or privately owned land, in order to feel that that their right is validated, if you like. And it's important for them to validate the use of these resources, and that they're not basically just freeloading, or that they're just accessing things for free, making money out of it, and the community gets nothing out of it. So there is this kind of ethical, if you like, aspect that we see with these entrepreneurs very often, where they volunteer to pay some kind of fee or whatever to the community. It's also important that the firm's activities do not disturb the resources they utilize. So if you're doing something in an area, that you make sure that you're not actually, for example, changing the behavior of the animals. You know, you don't feed them. You don't encourage the animals to come in an area, especially if they're dangerous animals like bears or whatever. There's a recurring notion that the small scale of the operations means they do not bother other stakeholders, so they set limits on the type of tours that they offer. They're very small scale, they're not large numbers. But there is a worry on behalf of these entrepreneurs at the moment that if tourism grows in general, that the right of public access, when a lot of groups come and a lot of companies set up, that might become an eventual threat to the environment and to the landowners. And actually, this is just a side note I want to mention, is that this year, because of COVID-19, one of the strange things that has happened in Sweden is because people haven't traveled abroad for tourism, there's been kind of a phenomenon of a lot of Swedes going on holidays to areas such as Dalarna. And so now the problem this last summer has been over-tourism in public areas and on private areas in the Swedish countryside, because more and more Swedes have stayed at home. And so that's kind of an interesting side effect of COVID-19, that even though tourism has dropped internationally, it has actually locally in some parts of Sweden has actually had a phenomenal increase over the summer. So something to think about. So some final thoughts. You know, how do we use the bricolage framework? Well, it can be used to describe, explain, and explore how microfilms in tourism operate. It's a way for us, when we do studies of entrepreneurs, to move beyond just looking at their motivations and their identity, you know, who they are, and basically understanding more about why they do what they do and how they do it. It allows us to develop knowledge about a topic that can advance our understanding of the supply side of tourism. It allows us, it allows public bodies, tourism organizations and other organizations to better understand how to support small-scale tourism microfilms. And in Sweden in particular, where we have, well, also the other Nordic countries like Norway, Denmark, and Finland, for example, where we have the right of public access, it basically allows this ambiguity of the right of public access to be addressed in a way that formalizes agreements between landowners and tourism entrepreneurs. What I mean by that is that, as I said before, even though there's no law that I have to pay a landowner for using his land, a lot of these entrepreneurs feel that in order to be okay with the landowners, they essentially feel that they have to pay some kind of fee and have some kind of agreement on paper so that they don't have any trouble in the future. What can we do? Future studies about bricolage. We can look at resource transfer, what helps and what is an obstacle for transferring resources. We can study institutions in terms of why, how, what occurs. And we can also, if we're doing more geographical studies, we can look at this tension that exists between being geographically embedded, situated in a particular area, and dealing with various challenging local institutions. And I have this quote here where from a person who said, rural living is not for everyone. You have to be resourceful in a different way. So that forces you to find different ways to use what already exists. You know, you might, as I said before, not have a lot of resources. It allows a different way to relate to growth. And it is imperative when we talk about spatial bricolage that alongside with the idea of making do with what there is, it is also about making with the spatial context and everyone and everything that it includes. So basically not just taking advantage of the resources, but making sure that we take advantage of the resources, but with the agreement of the local community. I have here the key reference, which was, as I said, this paper, which was published in Journal of Sustainable Tourism. If anybody's interested, there's a link to it. And I'm sure that Darko will be willing to share it with you. With that, I would like to thank everyone. I am sorry that I went much longer than I thought I would. Thank you very much again for inviting me. And hopefully one day I will be able to visit your fine country and meet you in person. With that, thank you very much. Bye-bye.